Doesn't it? Okay. All right, that's better. I think. I don't know. Welcome to Uncolored. I'm Kevin Metcalf, and today I'm going to do something. Now, this time I'm going to do something different. This is going to be a bit something that just popped up a couple of days ago that I think perfectly illustrates the last video I did when I was talking about data sets and ideas and dogma. They get mixed up with each other, and I think really bad consequences happen when you mix ideas and dogma together and you're not properly dealing with the data. And I think this is a perfect example. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna run a video, and again, I didn't spend a whole lot of time, digging through this because it's pretty much what we just talked about last time. But I thought it was a perfect example of how you can go wrong if you don't properly represent data and then arrange it properly. And if you don't do that, you're not going to be able to accommodate that in any worldview that works. So let's look at the slide where I came from, where I started at. This is where I left off, or sort of the intro to the last video. So let's just go over that. What I came up with as a worldview, and this is not the definition, this is just something that I'm working with, and I think it captures the idea, but maybe it doesn't. I know. A good worldview is an idea or set of ideas or way of understanding reality that can accurately represent one and successfully accommodate all relevant data sets. So again, what I'm talking about is there's all of these things that present themselves to you. You read a book, have a conversation, you're walking along the street, you see, I don't know, a tire, right? All of that's data. And if you can accurately represent that data, meaning you're looking at the data, and when you take it in, it's actually what is out there, right? The conversation that you had, what you're hearing, the data that you're taking in is actually what that person was saying, and not something that's been twisted by a presupposition or a bias or something like that. You're actually hearing what that person says, okay? Reading a book, same idea. You're taking in that data, and you're accurately representing that data. And if you're doing that properly, you're probably going to get better information. And then with that information, you can draw conclusions that accurately represent reality. That's what I think is I'm trying to get at. I think I'm trying to get at. Well, who would know if not me? So what I want to do is show you a video. And this is one of a guy named Dr. Greg Koukl. Now, I don't know a lot about Dr. Koukl. But he's a Christian guy, affirms God, and he's got a bunch of great videos. He's an apologist, done a lot of stuff. So I don't know necessarily anything about him. I haven't really dug into anything that he's done, but I have seen some of his videos and some of the things he's talked about, and I don't see a problem. But again, I don't know. He's talking about this idea of Molinism. Now, I can't tell you what Molinism is, and because of that. And it's not that I don't know, although I may not know. It can be complicated, and I don't want to pretend like I understand it. There are people out there who know it way better than I do, who are excellent at understanding those ideas. Two people I would point you to is obviously Dr. Craig. He's probably the most famous person talking about Molinism, famous apologist talking about Molinism, or person, I guess, either way. And the other guy I would direct you to is a guy named Dr. Tim Stratton. He's a young guy who's got a channel on the YouTubes called Free Thinking Ministries, I think is the channel name. He's a young guy who's just written a book on Molinism. I don't have a picture of it, and I guess I should if you're really interested in understanding it. But if you really want to know what it is, these are folks who I think give you the best representation of it. And again, I'll include at the bottom some links to videos by Dr. Craig, where he explains it for himself. And if you really want to understand it, at least from his perspective, I think that's probably the best place to go. And the reason why I'm giving you Dr. Craig's videos is because it seems that Dr. Koukl is critiquing specifically Dr. Craig's understanding of Molinism. Okay, Molinism, basically, just to give you what I think it is, it's this idea that God has the knowledge of, if I get this right, what people would freely choose in any given circumstance. Okay. Now, I think that that idea works, although, again, I don't know enough about it to tell you. But I think that that coincides much more with what we had talked about a couple of videos ago, where I talked about how fatalism and determinism both posit the idea that for any event, right, whether it's the smallest particle or the sum total of all events in the universe at any moment for however many moments that you want to talk about, okay, you call that an event. One particle, everything. What the fatalist and the determinist will tell you, or at least this is their ideology, or this is the idea of determinism and fatalism, is that for that value, whatever that event is, there could only be one possible value. Couldn't have happened any other way, is what they're saying, basically. So if you sat down in a chair, it was impossible that you could have not sat down in that chair. That's what they're saying. The way I think the world really is that there's a multitude of possibilities out there. And I think that's true of our experience. That's true logically, I believe. And I think that I've also made a case that biblically supports the idea that there are other possible options other than the one that actually happened. Okay. So the question that I think Molinism answers is, what would happen in those other possibilities? Or it doesn't answer that question. Well, I guess maybe it does answer that question, because there are examples in the Bible where God does say, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. So that's really what middle knowledge is about, I think. God knows what people would freely choose, not determined to choose, but would freely choose under any circumstance. That's what I think Molinism is. But you're going to hear people smarter than me talk about it, so I don't know why I wasted the time. So what I first want you to do is just listen to a quick thing with Dr. Craig talking about Molinism, or it's an introduction to Molinism that he's going to talk about. Because what I want you to do is evaluate what Dr. Craig says about it by what Dr. Koukl, how Dr. Koukl critiques it. And I want you to see for yourself. I'm not going to tell you up in the front, offhand. I'm not going to front load this with, what I think. But I want you to see for yourself as you're listening to what Koukl says about what Dr. Craig says, and see if it's an accurate representation. And afterwards, I'll tell you what I think. All right. So here's Dr. Craig. Let me see if I can make this work. Talking about Molinism.
We've been talking about divine omniscience, God's being all-knowing. And in the last class, we raised a problem that is occasioned by God's knowledge of the future. If God foreknows everything that happens, including our choices, then are we really free to do otherwise than as God foreknows we shall do? In other words, does God's foreknowledge imply a kind of theological fatalism about the future, that everything that happens, happens necessarily? And I argue that that conclusion does not follow, so long as we keep clear the distinction between the chronological priority of God's knowledge to the event foreknown, but the logical or explanatory priority of the event foreknown to God's knowledge.
Now, I'm going to stop it right there, because this is where it gets into it, and can be a little bit complicated, at least for people like me. I had to listen to it. I've listened to this, not just this one, several times, many, many times, dozens of times even. And it can be difficult to kind of fit into your head and fold up and put in your brain, but I don't think it's necessary. The basic ideas that I wanted you to get from there, it seems to me that Dr. Craig makes it clear that this idea of middle knowledge, or Molinism, that he goes on to talk about, he tells you why he's presenting it, to deal with the idea of God's omniscience and human freedom. Because some would think that God's omniscience, knowing everything that's going to occur, or having God's omniscience, and I'm not quite sure knowing everything's going to occur is the proper way to explain that. I'm not quite sure. But God knowing everything, we'll just say that. I don't know why I do. This is, I'm the worst person for this. Um, but you could come to the idea, I mean, it's a reasonable thing to think that, boy, if God knows everything, then how does my free will fit into that? And Molinism, according to Dr. Craig and others like Tim Stratton, helps you understand how those two can work together without leading to fatalism, the idea that there's only one value for any particular event. That's what I think Dr. Craig is talking about. So that's what it seems like he's going on into. But again, I'll put that in the video down below so you can make your own decision, which is what you should be doing. But let's get into what someone else, an idea someone else has, and this is Dr. Koukl. Oh, by the way, if you're interested in a full treatment that's just not on a video, a much better treatment, or I shouldn't say better, if you like to read about it, this book by William Legge and Craig, Dr. Craig, The Only Wise God, does a very good example of talking about Molinism. But I think, at least for me, it's pretty clear that the idea that he's talking about, or the context within he's talking about Molinism, is, again, God's omniscience and foreknowledge and free will, and how that doesn't lead to the idea of fatalism. That's really what he's talking. That's what I think is going on there. But again, you got to figure it out for yourself. So what I'm going to do now is see if I can do this. I don't know. I'm going to put up Dr. Greg Koukl, who also talks about this idea of Molinism and what he concludes from it. Let me see if I can get this thing going on. This will flip over. I think I got it. All right.
There's been a lot of discussion lately about Molinism, and a lot of folks don't know what that is. It's spelled Molinism, and it's a popular view among certain philosophers that are Arminian in persuasion, in theological persuasion, and have used this to help them solve some problems that relate to the question of election and free.
So let me stop you right there. I apologize. I'm going to be stopping the video. It's a 6-minute video, and I'll be stopping, pausing along the way, and maybe skipping ahead because, again, you'll be able to look at it for yourself. But I just want to, as we go along, just make some distinctions. Now, as I said, I don't know about Dr. Koukl. I think he's a doctor, I guess. I don't know. I don't know about his views, if he's a Calvinist, non-Calvinist. But one thing that I picked up while I was studying Calvinism for the past year is that there's sometimes tells. You can sometimes a Calvinist will, tell, like a poker game. There's certain things they do that you go, oh, this probably a Calvinist you're talking to, but not all the time. Who knows? Don't generalize or those things. But you see how Dr. Koukl divided up the theological worlds into Calvinists and Arminians, right? He said that this Molinism is an idea that Arminians use. Now, he didn't say only Arminians do. I'm simply saying that sometimes, there are some Calvinists who seem to divide the world up into people who are Calvinists, and then anybody who's not a Calvinist is an Arminian, which seems like a pretty myopic way of understanding the world. I think there's a lot of ways to understand the reality of God without being a Calvinist or an Arminianism. And if I understand correctly, Arminianism is basically Calvinism. They just don't accept all the crazy ideas of Calvinism, just, some of the other crazy ideas. But I don't know. You have to look at it for yourself. I just wanted to point out that so far it's kind of a narrow view of Molinism. I don't think it necessarily misrepresents it. But I also think that there's, again, what we're looking for is, does that representation of Molinism account for all data sets? Because when you're listening to ideas, sure, in a small context, what you were told might work. But when you start to expand that to see, well, can it account for these other data sets that are clearly related? Does it account for those? And I'm simply, to me, I don't think that particular characterization of Molinism really accounts for all data sets, because I don't even know if Dr. Craig is an Arminianist or if he would consider himself an Arminianist, or if it really applies to just Arminians. I don't think it does. But let's continue on. I just wanted to make that clear.
Freedom. Probably the best known philosopher who uses this and has promoted it is William Lane Craig. In order to understand what middle knowledge is, I need to construct a little bit of a line graph, if you will, of different types of knowledge that God has. On the one hand, God has what's called natural knowledge. And natural knowledge is all knowledge of things that must of necessity be the case, maybe the laws of logic and the like, and all things that are possible. So the full range of possibilities of what might or could be the case theoretically in any given universe, these are all part of God's natural knowledge. That's everything that's possible, God's natural knowledge. He knows all the possibilities. He also knows all the actualities, all the things that actually are the case, all the facts of the world, all true propositions. That is the world that he ended up freely creating out of all the possibilities that he knew were the case. And that's called God's free knowledge. So you have on one end of the spectrum, you have God's natural knowledge, all possibilities. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have God's free knowledge, a much smaller set of the things that actually are true. Right in the middle, you have middle knowledge, according to some, the way some characterize this. And middle knowledge is a smaller set of what's possibly true, but a larger set of what's actually true. And this has to do with the possibilities of human free will. So middle knowledge is what any free creature might do under any given set of circumstances. So it certainly is logically possible that Greg Koukl could receive Christ, or he may not receive Christ. That's the possibility. But it might turn out that because of who Greg Koukl is, there is no actual possibility, no matter what circumstances I would face, that I would ever freely choose Christ. That's why.
So far, I think that's an okay representation. I don't know if that's exact. I don't know if, again, people like Stratton or Craig would say, yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Because again, I don't know that it's nitpicky, but again, if you want to accurately represent ideas, I think it's important to be very, very, very careful about how you express things. And I think what Dr. Craig would say, because I've heard him correct people a couple of times, it's not about what people will do in a different circumstances. That's not correct. It's also, I think it's also incorrect to say that middle knowledge is what people might do in a particular circumstance. I don't think that's correct. And I think that's how Dr. Koukl represented it. And I think that's false. I think the correct representation, and again, I've heard, the only reason I know this is because I've heard Dr. Craig, again, correct people several times. Not the same person, but in several venues when he's talking about it. He has to correct people who are trying to figure it out. What Dr. Craig says is what middle knowledge is God's knowledge of what people would do in any given circumstance. Not will, not might, but would. That's how he explains it. I'm not quite sure why that distinction is necessary, but again, I don't know it that well. I just wanted to say that because I wanted to clear it up so that, again, we want to accurately represent our data sets when we're talking about, representing ideas. So I wanted to clear that one up.
This middle knowledge is a smaller set than possibilities because it has to do with what might be called the counterfactuals of human freedom. In other words, those things that are true didn't happen, but might have happened if we were exposed to this possibility. So when David asks God, if I go up and give myself up, will these people take me and capture me and kill me? And God says, yeah, if you do that, then they will do that. And so David chooses not to do that. So it never takes place, but it would have happened if he had.
So that's a clear example of Craig uses that very same example to talk about Molinism. So again, I'm not saying that Dr. Koukl's off track. I think he's pretty much on track. He probably understands it better than I do. I'm simply saying that again, you want to be very, very clear about ideas when you're representing them and thinking about them so that you don't come up with bad conclusions. And that takes effort. It's painstaking. Okay, so I'm going to move ahead a little bit and talk about, this is a different idea that Dr. Koukl brings up.
Not plausible, given the limitations of anybody's individual choices. There are some circumstances some people would choose, and some circumstances some people would not choose. And so what God does is he knows all of these possibilities, and what he does is he actualizes, he creates the world in which most people will choose to become Christians. And so this is how election is characterized. God elects that world in which most people will freely choose him. And so that's how.
So here again, I think that's not actually correct. But again, I'm not the person to know about Molinism. We'd have to talk to Dr. Craig or Dr. Tim Stratton. But it seems like what Dr. Koukl is saying is that what the Molinists would assert is that God chooses the world where the most people would freely choose to, would choose God, choose to be in a relationship with God. And that's the world that he actualizes. Now, I've actually heard Dr. Craig use this particular scenario too to explain how God picks a world. The only correction I would make, or the only point I would make, is that I don't know that that's what every Molinist would say Molinism is about. God picking the world that would have the most people, who would choose them. That's just a supposition that they use of what possible reason God may pick one world over another. In other words, I don't think that this is a tenet of Molinism, that God picks the world that will have the most people, go to heaven. That's how I would say it. But I think what they're really saying is that's just a possible reason why God would pick one world over a different world. So I guess what I want to make it clear is that the way Dr. Koukl explained it is something that Molinists will talk about, and Dr. Craig has talked about it several times. I don't know that that's a tenet of Molinism, that that's the way God picks worlds. So I want you to be clear. I think that that's something that you should really dig into to see if that's actually true or not, because I don't know that that's a proper representation of it.
How the theological issues are kind of addressed by adopting a Molinistic view. Now, I actually don't hold to Molinism, that is, with that application. I certainly believe in the concept that there's a set of God's knowledge that entails the counterfactuals of human freedom. But classically, before Molina, who kind of authored this idea, middle knowledge was just subsumed under God's natural knowledge. So
I'm going to skip ahead to the next part because I don't want to go too long. This is the next part where I think it's pretty important to understand. Let me see if we get this in here.
In the scripture, regardless of what side of the spectrum from my perspective, this doesn't solve any problems, because where they put it in the line drawing, as it were. The important thing is that from my perspective, this doesn't solve any problems, because when the issue of election comes up in the scripture, regardless of what side of the spectrum you adopt, whether it's Calvinistic or Arminian, the question of election has to do with individuals in the text.
So you can see what he did again, right? He divides the theological world, or the theistic world, I guess would be, into two camps, right? You're a Calvinist, and if you're not a Calvinist, then you're an Arminian. I don't know that that's really correct. And I'm pretty sure that doesn't account for all data sets. There are many people who say, I don't think Calvinism is correct. There are a lot of people who say, I don't think provision. I got Flowers channel stuck in my head. But that's a perfect example. Dr. Flowers doesn't think he's an Arminianist, doesn't think he's an Arminianist. Dr. Flowers doesn't consider himself an Arminianist. So the point I'm making is, Koukl seems to have a very myopic view of the theistic world. You're either a Calvinist or you're an Arminianist, and there doesn't seem to be any other data sets that he's considering for his particular worldview. His particular worldview has the data set of Calvin, and then it has the data set of Arminius, and no other data sets need apply. I don't know that that's the best way to build a worldview, by ignoring other data sets of people who understand God from a perspective that isn't Calvinist or Arminian. if you walk into the world, I think, or should I say, if you're walking around thinking that, well, if you're not a Calvinist, then you're Arminian, I think that's a misrepresentation of the data, of all the data. And it's an example of someone who has a worldview that simply ignores a lot of data sets. That's what that appears to me. Now, I don't know if that's the case. He might, in another topic, talk about all kinds of different people who have all kinds of different beliefs. As I said, I don't know a lot about Dr. Koukl. I'm just going from what he's saying here. Seems to me you're a Calvinist or you're an Arminian, and that's all there is, which I think is a poor way to represent the world in general, but specifically the theistic world. That's not the best way to represent it, in my opinion. The other thing he does is, you see how he immediately ties this to election. Okay. Now, the reason I played you the part of Dr. Craig in the beginning talking about God's omniscience and foreknowledge with regard to our human freedom, because that's not necessarily an issue about election. It's a far more, in my opinion, comprehensive issue about everything we do all day, every day. If you're thinking that God is omniscience, it's not just about whether or not you're going to heaven, or that's what Calvinists think election is. And that seems to be what Dr. Koukl is shoving into the word of election, is salvation. I think he makes a mistake in, one, shoving the idea of salvation into election, which is what I think he's doing here. And two, the idea that Molinism is really just an idea to fix election. Because you heard earlier he said that, in his opinion, middle knowledge doesn't fix anything. Well, and if I'm reading Dr. Koukl right, and I don't know, I could be wrong, so I apologize if I am. If he thinks that election means election to salvation, then his problem isn't Molinism. His problem is a twisted version of Calvinism. Not even a twisted version of Calvinism. Calvinism is a twisted version of the Bible. Because the Bible, at least as I read it, election isn't necessarily about salvation, if it is at all. Election seems to be God choosing people for a particular service. And it sounds to me, although, he's not very clear about it, he's not clear enough about it for me to understand what he's saying. But he seems to think election is about salvation, because he'll go on to say that God elects individuals. And I'm not sure that that's true. Did he say that already? Let me keep playing. But the point I'm making is that I don't know that Dr. Koukl is accurately representing Calvinism from a number of perspectives. One, Calvinism isn't necessarily just about election. It's a broader idea about omniscience and human beings having free will, the free will of human creatures, or any creature, I guess. It doesn't have to be just human. Secondly, I don't think that he's representing properly the aim of Molinism. Molinism, I don't think, was invented to fix a twisted version of election that Calvinism brought forth. I think that Molinism may have been just a way to understand, again, God's omniscience, God's foreknowledge, and human freedom. I think that's a broader perspective. So what I'm saying is, while Dr. Koukl isn't totally off, I think he misrepresents Molinism enough so that I don't know that his position is credible. At least it wouldn't be for me, because there's just too many mistakes that have been made so far. But, you might have a different opinion on that. Let's continue.
Not with worlds, and on the view that Bill Craig has advanced using Molinism to solve this election has to do with individuals in the text, whether it's Calvinistic or Arminian.
Let me just back that up a bit, because I want you to hear this part.
Of the spectrum you adopt, whether it's Calvinistic or Arminian, the question of election has to do with individuals in the text, not with worlds. And on the view that Bill Craig has advanced using Molinism to solve this problem, God is electing worlds. And if you're not sure about that, I actually checked with him directly and asked him if that's his view. He does not elect individuals on that view. He elects a world in which individuals make a libertarian free choice for or against him.
So again, and this is just my opinion, I think that's another misrepresentation on two fronts. Let's deal with the second one first. He said that on Dr. Craig's view that Molinism, again, is about election. And election seems to be, in the context that Dr. Koukl is talking about, has to do with salvation. And what Koukl is saying is that Craig's view is that God elects the world where the most free creatures would be saved. And I'm not quite sure that that's what Dr. Craig would say. I know he's used that, again, as an example of what possible reasons it might be. But even the word election, okay, I think when Calvinists use election, and again, I don't know that whether Koukl is a Calvinist or not, but it sounds like. When Calvinists use election, they're immediately thinking salvation. And that's why I think Koukl made the mistake, and I think it's a clear error, that election's about individuals and not worlds. Because election, if I understand correctly, and again, I'm the least credible person talking about that stuff, always talk to a credible source, read credible material, don't go by what I'm saying. But if I understand it correctly, election simply means choose. Okay? God chooses people for a particular service. Okay? And if you talk to Dr. Flowers, what Dr. Flowers says is that election is always about God choosing a person for service for the benefit of other people. God never elects someone to the negation of other people, which is what you would have to do if you're thinking of a Calvinist twisted version of election. But if you look at the biblical version of election, according to Dr. Flowers and other smart folks, doesn't mean they're right, but, there's another opinion is all I'm saying. There's another way to look at it. They look at it, one, is that God is always electing people. When he's electing people, when it's about people, it's electing them to service, and that service is to benefit all of mankind, not electing people to the neglect of mankind, which makes sense if you look at about Israel. And this leads into the second point. Election in the Bible, it's not just about individuals. That's a mistake. And it's surprising that somebody as smart as Koukl would make such a blatant error. God chose all of Israel. That's not an individual. Okay? And all of Israel, some of them rejected their calling to be God's priests. But that's a clear example, it seems to me, of God electing a whole group of people, not just individuals. God elected the apostles. Okay? Now, you might say, well, those were individuals they elected. Okay, fine. And that's fine. But you've got a group of 12 people who are elected for a specific purpose, is what I'm illustrating. Not unto salvation. And I think Koukl has it in his head, or at least it sounds to me, although I don't want to make book on it, he's mixing election with salvation. And clearly, all of the Jews, some of them rejected God even though they were elect. Not all the apostles. Though they were all 12 elected, not all of them made it. So this idea that election equals salvation is false just on those two premises. So I think that if what Koukl is doing is trying to shove salvation into election, that's an error. And an error that only Calvinists make. I shouldn't say that. Maybe there are other people who make them, but Calvinists, over the last year that I've studied, love to make the error of making election about salvation. And that's just false, just on the two examples that I gave you. But here's another problem. He's also making what you would call a negative inference fallacy. The negative inference fallacy, and I just learned this. I don't want you to sound like I knew this all the time. I just learned this. But this negative inference fallacy is basically saying, because Bill does X, then he never does Y. So if you were to say, if you had a buddy and you guys go golfing all the time, because you and your friend are always going golfing, it would be a negative inference fallacy to say he doesn't like tennis or likes going swimming. He may love those things. He's just never done them around you. So the idea that because God elects individuals, and clearly he does, Jonah and the whale, to say that he doesn't elect also groups of people like Israel or the apostles, or elects things other than people, like the land of Canaan. Canaan was a land out of all of the world that God picked, chose, elect, whatever word you like to use, for his people. So the idea that Koukl is advancing here, that God only elects individuals, I think is blatantly false. And it's stunning to me that somebody who knows so much about the Bible, as it seems like he does, can make such a blatant error. I think that's false. God selects not only lands, he selected, what was it, like a ram or a sheep or a goat to save Isaac when Jacob and him were going on that long walk. Was it a ram? I don't know what it was. Read your Bible. You should figure it out. And all of these things that I'm talking about, always read your Bible. You figure it out for yourself. Don't let me tell you what's going on in the world. That's your responsibility. Shaking my finger. Point I'm making is this. There are just a few, in just a couple of seconds, the idea that God only chooses individuals, it's 100% false. The idea that election means salvation, 100% false. And unfortunately, Dr. Koukl, and again, if he's a Calvinist, he's being a good Calvinist because he's not being clear about when he says election, what he thinks election is. You know, people will talk about, Lord, the doctrine of election. There's no such thing as a doctrine of election. The Bible uses the word election in very specific contexts and for very specific reasons, and you should know what each use means in its context. There is no doctrine of election where election means the same thing all the time. That would be foolish, I think. If you're reading the word and it says election, you should know exactly what it means in the context. And I've just given you just a couple of examples where God's making choices. And I flip back and forth between election and choices because I don't fill up the word election with all of the nonsense that many theologians tend to fill it up with. It just means God made a choice. God chose that ram or that goat or whatever it is to save Isaac. All kinds of animals he could have picked. He picked a goat or a ram or whatever it was. So the idea that Koukl says that God only elects people, I think that's patently false. Now, I could be wrong. I'm no biblical scholar, and he apparently is. But I don't know. It seems to me that that's a very, very narrow view of what election is. And not only me, but there are a number of people who are really smart, who study their Bible just like Greg Koukl, go, yeah, that's a bunch of bunk. And so rejecting Molinism or saying that it doesn't fix a problem, I don't know that there's a problem for Molinism to fix if election is the thing you're talking about. The only problem that election has, if there's a problem, is you're a Calvinist. And you've got a twisted view of election that's not supported by the Bible, as I've just talked about. Election just means choice. Listen, here's an example of election. Because again, I heard somebody just a couple of days ago, I was at the coffee shop, maybe it was yesterday, where I do my reading there. And he was talking about election. Oh, there's this big conflict between election and free will. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I mean, I didn't say that to him. Eventually I did because I interrupted. I'm such an idiot. But I like to talk to people. Yeah. But I interrupted and I asked him. He's a youth pastor. And I said, when you say election, what are you talking about? And so we started talking about it. And it turned out he wasn't pushing, Calvinism. He was very open-minded, understood there were different interpretations of it. So he wasn't hammering any crazy ideology. But he's operating under this nonsense impression that there's some idea, there's a problem between election and a human's free choice. And I'm like, where do you get that from? Listen, before I was born, you know what I was elected to? Going to school by my dad. He elected me to go to school before I was even born. And guess what I did? I went to school because he made it clear that that was the best option for me in a number of ways. Didn't matter whether I wanted to go to school or not. It had nothing to do with my free will. I had free will, but I did what my dad said. Why? That's what he elected me to. Right? If you're at work and your boss says, "Hey, Henderson, you're going to be handling the Hanrahan project. You're heading it up." Guess what? You just got elected. Whoa, wait, what's a conflict between election and free will? No, it isn't. Only if you're a knucklehead is there a problem between election and free will. Just like your dad or your parents, if you had good parents, they will elect you to do certain things. I was elected to do the trash in my home. That was my job. Didn't do it very well, didn't always do it, but I was elected for that. No conflict between election and free will if you're thinking clearly, it seems to me. Only if you shove a bunch of theological and ideological nonsense into the word election, now you got problems, right? It's like a crack fiend. You know, people don't have a problem getting back and forth to work unless you're smoking crack. Now you got a problem, right? You don't have a problem, you know, taking care of your family and, you know, having a normal day if you're not smoking crack. If you're smoking crack, you got a problem with all those things. And Calvinism seems to be the same, where it shoves all these weird ideas. So suddenly I've got a problem with reading the Bible. I don't know what the word all means. I got to work out some other meaning of the word all. Why? You're smoking theological crack. It's Calvinism that does that. Election means going to heaven before the foundation of the world. If that was really what was going on, honestly, why would you even read the Bible? Why would you do anything? I know this isn't what I had talked about. I didn't start on this, but literally, think about it. Because I don't believe Calvinism believes their own nonsense. If you believe before the foundation of the world, you were elected, chosen to go to heaven, right? So world hasn't started yet, okay? And then this is the end of the world. And God has figured out that at this point, you're going to make it to this point and you're going to heaven. And there's nothing in here that's going to change that. Then what are you reading your Bible for? Throw it away. You might go, well, Kev, God uses means. Well, he can use means other than the Bible, couldn't he? Doesn't need the Bible. If he's already figured it out. And here's the other side. If you haven't been elected, you could read your Bible from the day you learn to read till you die. And if you weren't elected, guess what? You've just wasted a life because you weren't elected. If Calvinists really believed in this nonsense idea of election, nope, I wouldn't. If I really believe in election, I'd go swimming. That would be my whole, what do you call it, evangelistic thing? Let's go swimming. You're like, Kev, shouldn't you be reading the Bible? Why? You're either elected or not. You're either going to heaven or you're not. So we could read the Bible all day, and if you were elected, you're going to go anyway. And if you're not elected, we've just wasted time. So let's go swimming. Right? I mean, doesn't that make sense logically? If you think everybody was picked out before the beginning of time, the whole of human history is a big waste. What are we doing it for? No, God uses means. It's nonsense. Okay, stop it. I apologize for going on that rant, but it's just, it's crazy. It's a crazy idea that no one believes. And you don't even have to go to the Bible. Just, it's dumb on its face. People go, well, you're not exegeting or using her. You don't need that. You know, if somebody goes, hey, Kev, when you're not looking, frogs wear baseball caps. And then when you turn around and look, they take them off and put them away so you can't find them. Okay, I'm not running to my Bible to see if I can find scriptures. You know what? It's silly. That's why. It's a silly idea. Why would I waste time digging out and doing it when somebody says something that just doesn't make sense? And here's the thing. Even if it was true, even if frogs are always wearing baseball caps until I look at them and then they don't wear the baseball cap, who cares? Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And that's what Calvinism seems to me. Even if you believe the nonsense, guess what you do? You act like it's not true. That's what Koukl's doing. If he's a Calvinist, I don't know if he's a Calvinist, so I may be wrong. But he's acting like Calvinism isn't true. Why? Because he's trying to figure all this out and preach to other people when whoever's going to go to heaven's already been decided who's going to heaven, and people who aren't going to heaven, they're not going to heaven. So whatever Dr. Koukl figures out, what's it matter? Well, God uses means. Doesn't need Koukl. All kinds of means God could use to do whatever it is he wants to do. Doesn't need Koukl. Doesn't need me. So again, I apologize for going on this crazy rant, but it can drive you nutty, man. Calvinism, it's crazy. So I don't know if Greg Koukl's a Calvinist. It starts to sound like it with the way he's talking, this whole idea that Molinism doesn't solve the problem of election. Well, that's not the problem that needs to be solved by Molinism, because election isn't a problem if you're not on theological crack. That's why. Just stop using crack. Get out of Calvinism. And suddenly all these things aren't problems for you. That's really the thing, not Molinism. That's how it seems to me. All right. That was bad. I'll probably cut all of that out because it was such, I'll look at it and go, you're being an idiot. Of course, that would be the whole. All right, here we go. Let's finish up.
And it doesn't strike me that this is the way the scripture characterizes the concept of election. Election is of individuals, however it is that you understand election to work out theologically. And since election is of individuals in the scripture, not of worlds, then Molinism and the theological work it is supposed to do for people doesn't appeal to me, because it doesn't solve any problems for me.
Okay, back on track and not on this craziness. Cut that out. So he says, God, or election is about individuals and not about worlds. Here's another problem that you're dealing with. And I talked about this negative inference fallacy. But let's just talk about it with regard to data sets. So the data set that says that God elects individuals, pretty strong, okay? It's pretty strong. You've got, just take Jonah and the whale. That's a data set that says that God selected an individual for a service for the benefit of the world. And he says, you're going to Nineveh. That's the only place in the Bible that I'm really sure about. Jonah and Nineveh, if I got that right. That was a big thing when I was a kid, Jonah. But that's clear. That's a clear data set. It seems to me that God has elected an individual. Fine. But if I'm going to make the case that God doesn't select worlds or doesn't select anything other than individuals, I got to make a case for that. And Dr. Koukl has made no case for that whatsoever. As a matter of fact, I've already shown you that God selects whole races of people. He selects groups of people. He selects rams or birds or whatever it is that helped Isaac out at that time. He selects lands for people, for his people. So the idea that God only chooses individuals and that's all that election is about, I think that's a messed up view. And you might be on that drug if you're coming up with that idea. Because God clearly selects other things than just individuals. But at any rate, you can't take one data set that supports this idea. God chooses individuals. That's a pretty clear data set. But now I'm going to throw all of this other idea on top of that data set. Can't do that. The idea that God does not select worlds needs its own data set. You've got to give evidence. You've got to give some examples. You've got to be able to point to me and say, hey, Kev, if you read this verse, or if you read this chapter, or if you look at these examples, it's very clear that God does not select worlds. Koukl hasn't made that case. Not at all. Hasn't even started. He's using that negative inference. Because God does this, well, he must never do that over there. Sorry. Got to make a case for that. And so this is a very, very, very weak argument, in my opinion. And it's really not, it's disappointing for somebody who appears to be so smart, like Dr. Koukl. He seems like a really smart guy. It's disappointing that somebody of his stature, because he's got a lot of videos, does a lot of stuff, a lot of great things, could have such a poor way of arguing for something. Non sequitur. It doesn't follow that God does not select worlds because he does select individuals. It doesn't follow that God doesn't select groups of people because he does select individuals. It doesn't follow that God doesn't select lands because he selects individuals. You can see how that negative inference thing works. And that's what Dr. Koukl is using to reject at least Dr. Craig's idea of Molinism. And I just think it's very, very weak and very unsupported. That's how it seems to me. But I've yammered on way farther than I thought I was. But let's see if there's any more here, if I got any more notes on
I
this.
hold to the notion of middle knowledge, but I don't call it middle knowledge. I'm comfortable with subsuming that under natural knowledge, or you could put it on the graph as middle knowledge if you like. The real issue is not whether God has that knowledge, everybody agrees, but whether or not that serves any other theological function or solves any theological problems. I think not.
So that's the end of the video. It's again, I think Dr. Koukl makes several mistakes in his reasoning. He has a myopic view of the theistic world, that there's just Calvinists and there are Arminians. I think that's false. And there's a whole bunch of data sets that would make that the case, that he does not incorporate into his worldview, whether willingly, whether ignorantly, just lazy, I don't know. But his idea is there's Calvinists and there's Arminians, at least from this video. That's the idea that I get. Secondly, I think he misrepresents what Molinism is about. It's not about the doctrine of election, or at least the Calvinist twisted doctrine of election. It's not what Molinism is about. Molinism is about. And in fact, you don't need Molinism to fix the problem of election if you drop the crack. If you get off Calvinism, you don't need Molinism to help you figure out election and free will, because there isn't a problem. Yeah, I'm the least credible person talking about it, so don't go by me. I'm just saying, when people talk about election, I go, yeah, God chose people for certain things to do stuff. I don't know why free will comes as a problem there, because again, we elect people to do stuff all the time. You know, my dad as one of them. And finally, he doesn't accurately represent data sets. That's what I just talked about. But he also ignores a bunch of data sets, right? Other ideas. And it seems to me that he's shoving in the idea of salvation into election where it doesn't seem to belong, which is creating his own problem. And to get out of, or to reject Molinism, or at least Dr. Craig's version of Molinism, he's using a non sequitur, because it doesn't follow that because God chooses individuals, that he doesn't choose worlds. That's a non sequitur. And two, it's the negative inference fallacy, because if you're going to say that God doesn't elect worlds, you've got to have your own unique set of data, not unique, but you have to bring forth whatever set of data that leads to that conclusion. Because the data set that leads to the conclusion that God only elects individual does not work for the conclusion that God does not elect worlds. Two separate data sets. And you've got to represent your data properly, and you've got to be able to, accommodate a worldview that can accommodate all data sets. And it doesn't seem to me, again, in the 6-minute video, this is the first time I ever talked about Greg Koukl or seen anything that he's done. It seems to me that he's just not representing the data properly, and his worldview doesn't seem to be able to accommodate all relevant data sets. And so for my judgment is not very good, not a very good job. But that's just me. I'm just, again, I'm just looking at it. This is what I think. You have to make up your own decision. You're going to have Dr. Craig's videos talking about Molinism. I'll probably throw in something by, I'll put Dr. Stratton's book in there too, if you want to read about it, because I think Dr. Stratton puts it in a way that might be more accessible. Although Dr. Craig does a very good job of making it accessible. Listen, that's how I figured it out mostly from his stuff. So I'll put all that stuff in there. You'll see the videos, links, so you can listen to it for yourself. And if you have any questions or comments, or if I got it wrong, listen, that happens. What could you expect from a guy like me? All right, that's enough. I'm out of here. Stop bothering me. Okay, next time.